This video is a bit different. It's from an Ask Me Anything thread, or an AMA for short. I hope you will enjoy it. I'm an ex-Scientologist, born and raised, and an ex-Sea Org member. I left the cult on my own volition. Ask me anything. Question. What, if anything, can people outside Scientology do to help people trapped in the cult? What an excellent question. This is a tricky area. Most people in the cult are brainwashed to the point that they believe you are the one who is nuts for not being a part of it. I think that spreading awareness of the truth about the cult is vital to narrowing the new cult recruit pool as much as possible. The more people know about the cult beforehand, the less likely they will be to get caught up in it. Most people who are already Scientologists are lost causes. I hate to say it, but it is the truth. I have only succeeded in talking one friend into leaving the cult, and she was never in the Sea Org. A handful of people I knew actually got kicked out of the cult, and that was the only reason they now have issues with the cult. If they hadn't gotten the boot, they would still be obedient little followers. The problem is this: if you are vocally opposed to the cult, then you must be a pedophile, rapist, murderer, or some other type of god-awful criminal. At least, that is what Scientologists are brainwashed to believe. It is beyond challenging to get anyone out of any cult. My parents are still in it, even after learning about all of the stuff I was subjected to. Question. What triggered you to leave? I endured many abuses during my time in the Sea Org. I turned 18 and finally got the courage to just do what had to be done in order to get them to let me go. I was fed up with the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, the starvation and sleep deprivation. The final straw for me was breaking my neck in a car accident where I was the passenger and finding myself being blamed for the fact that I had gotten in said accident and broken my neck. I supposedly had done something to deserve it. Question. What is the Sea Org versus regular Scientology? Just two names for the same thing, or is the one an inner chapter of the other? Essentially, the Sea Org is like an equivalent to the Vatican for the cult of Scientology. The Sea Org is where people are calling the shots for the lower level entities of the cult. In the Sea Org, you wear a Forks military uniform, live on site, and work your life away. They have a few hubs around the world. Sea Org members are typically abused more than other members of the cult, and most of them are slave laborers who endure starvation, sleep deprivation, inhumane living conditions, and sometimes even worse abuses like physical and sexual abuse. They are kept entirely cut off from the real world. Question. Since leaving, have you seen the various YouTube videos and documentaries by Mike Rind and Marty Rathbun at all? What is your opinion of their allegations of violent conduct by David Miscavige, the head of the church, and their allegations that he knowingly and willingly created a culture that promoted that kind of behavior? Also, in your time in the Sea Org, did you ever come across chairman of the board, David Miscavige? And if so, what kind of vibe did you get from him? You know, I watched/read a couple of things about Mike and Marty. I knew them in the Sea Org. They are criminals. It makes me so sick to see them profiting off their stories and getting fame from them. Those two men worked in close collaboration with David Miscavige to run the whole show when I was in the Sea Org. It is insulting to me that they get such recognition, and they themselves were a huge part of the problem when I was in. Yes, Miscavige is a sadistic person, and he perpetuated a culture of violence. But those men, Mike and Marty, chose to be a part of it, and when the time came that they fell from Miscavige's grace, they tried to turn around and blame him entirely for something they were a part of. They had a very cushy life in the Sea Org, and they did not endure the daily abuses that they inflicted upon so many others until perhaps the very end of their careers in the Sea Org. I refuse to watch any new documentaries that come out because I feel that they don't show the truth of how it is for the little people like myself in the Sea Org. Those men were abusing enslaved children. That is unforgivable in my book. When I was 13 and new to the Sea Org, I was instructed to carry a baton to whack people with if they got out of line. I can tell you that I never once hit anyone, no matter what I was told. I was defiant, and I did not follow orders, so I was punished repeatedly and excessively. I refused to perpetuate the cycle of violence in the cult and got in a lot of trouble over the years because of that. No matter what those men say, they always had the choice not to harm other people, but they did anyway. I did encounter David Miscavige once. It felt like a brush with death, or like I had just crossed paths with a demon. I was terrified. Also kind of amazed by how short he is. Follow-up question. Thank you for answering. I've had something of a morbid interest in cults, specifically Scientology, for a long time now. I've read and watched pretty much everything I could find online about it to date, including OT3. Still alive 5 years later. If you wouldn't mind, could you please elaborate on this? The user quotes a part of the earlier answer about Mike and Marty. In your experience, were they perfectly willing participants in the madness until they fell out of favor? Did you ever meet or interact with them? I know Marty specifically has gone on record multiple times saying he only did the bad things he did because he was compelled to by David Miscavige. To be fair to him, he's never denied anything and even reached out to publicly apologize to people he messed with. No problem. Anything I can do to help raise awareness. Yeah, I read OT3 and even OT8 years ago myself. Crazy stuff, right? Robot note, the OT thing they are talking about are material meant for seriously high-ranking members. It's some insane stuff about a space warlord and the creation of the current problem with humans basically. I recommend you Google the terms if you're curious. I don't want to be too specific about how I knew them, because I need to maintain anonymity for my family's safety, but I interacted with them both several times. But yes, I would definitely say that they were enthusiastically willing participants in obeying orders handed to them by Miscavige. They were known to write up their own policies for Sea Org members to obey as well. They may have been puppets to a certain extent, but they voluntarily did plenty of their own crap to people. Honestly, Marty was a much nicer person than Mike. I even felt bad for the dude at one point when I was in the Sea Org with him, because I suspected that he was suffering some abuses like me. Mike was just an outright sociopathic a-hole. I think that Marty is more forgivable than Mike. I really get sick at the thought of all the attention that Mike gets these days, and I suspect that if Leah Remini had any clue as to his true nature and behavior during his time in the Sea Org, she might not be so inclined to collaborate with him the way she does. Question. I know you said you were recruited to Sea Org to save the world, but what did they actually do? Any sort of charity work or mission type work, where they help communities? Or was it all to benefit Scientology? I've never been clear what they do aside from having a lot of abuse claims. Any charity work they do is just to try to recruit new members. It's nauseating. Oh, you're suicidally depressed because your marriage fell apart? We can fix that for you. Just cut a check for X amount of money and we will get you on the bridge to freedom. They will pop up in disaster areas when people are especially vulnerable, and they will rope people in for services that way. Every single thing done is to just get more money for the cult. The Sea Org is just a bullshit hierarchy put in place to ensure that the smaller branches of the cult are doing their jobs to get more people into the cult, which then brings in more money. I would liken it to a pyramid scheme, but the money all goes up to the top, to David Miscavige. No one is profiting from this except for that gash of a man. Question. How did your parents react? Have you ever watched the Scientology South Park episode? It was very messy when I finally came to them with how I felt and what had happened to me in the cult. I mistakenly thought that if I gave them the ultimatum of choosing me or the cult, they would choose me. Well, they did not choose me. That hurt beyond measure. So I cut them out of my life for a long time. I was a mess. It took some major contemplation on my part to decide that I was not willing to treat my family that way, and I needed to make the most of what I could get from them. Yeah, I watched the South Park episode years ago. Question. Did you ever think about going to the police or telling press about your experience? Oh boy did I. The police. Well, it was so many years after I escaped the cult that I would have an issue with statute of limitations. Not to mention the fact that it would be damn near impossible to get any Sea Org members to corroborate my story. That is just how the cult is. I'm also convinced that LAPD is bought and paid for by the cult, which is how the cult is left alone to enslave people in the Sea Org compounds the way they do. The press. When I first went public with my story 10 years ago, it was during the protest movement being led by Anonymous. They found my story and spread it across the internet as much as possible. I was contacted a couple of times by the press, but I was not willing to subject my child and my husband to the scrutiny of the press. I know how journalists behave, and I just would never put them through that. When Jason Begg left the cult, I talked to him for hours about the possibility of doing a YouTube expose the way that he had. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I was also scared of the cult harming my family. Question. Is Scientology really as sick and twisted as it's portrayed? Honestly, it is worse than how it is portrayed on TV and in books. So much worse. Follow-up question. Wow, I'm actually surprised. I'm so used to the media generally exaggerating things. Is it hard to escape from the cult? I imagine it's not something they make easy. Yeah, somehow, the media has aided in sweeping it under the rug in terms of just what goes on in the Sea Org. It was unbearably hard to get out. I had a couple of friends try to kill themselves in the process of trying to get out. I started trying to leave the Sea Org within 24 hours of joining it when I was 13. I realized I had made a huge mistake, and it was nothing like I had been told. It was too late though, they already had me. I spent the next 4.5 years trying to get out. They really try to break people in an effort to brainwash them to the point that they give up on trying to leave altogether and resign themselves to a lifetime of enslavement. Slavery is alive and well in the US. Just look at any Sea Org compound, and I can promise you that probably 99% of the people who are there don't actually want to be there and living that life. Follow-up question. Damn, that's terrible. It's both scary and amazing what twisted minds are capable of. What's the portrayed incentive of joining? Living out all your wildest dreams type of thing. It is something that will never cease to amaze me. And I'm in grad school studying forensic psychology. For someone like me, the attraction was that I would make my parents proud, and I would be one less mouth to feed in their very poor household. I grew up with having both of my parents work for branches of the cult. We never had money, and often there was a huge food shortage in our house. My mom worked at one of the cult's schools so that I would be able to get my education there. She got free tuition for me, worth something ridiculous like $1,500 a month, and she felt I would get a better education that way than if I attended a public school with non-Scientologists. That is pretty normal for a family of Scientologists. They don't want their kids exposed to anyone who is not in the cult, for fear they will become corrupted. By the time I was 12, my little brother was in kindergarten at the same school. It was okay for a bit, but then they got a new headmaster who said that my parents would have to pay for one of us. Since I was 12, they figured they could pull me from school and I could just take classes at the local branch of the cult to get trained up as a good cult follower. It was there that I was finally discovered by Sea Org recruiters. They convinced me that I would be saving the world if I joined. I was a gullible 13-year-old, so along I went. The overall theme they use when recruiting anyone is that they will be saving mankind and will be a part of something that will alter the course of destiny. Question. If you don't mind sharing, what kind of practices go on behind the veil in the organization that you have witnessed? Sexual, physical, and psychological abuse bordering on torture. I have been subjected to them myself. Starvation and sleep deprivation are regular practices. Denial of medical care is another. I witnessed forced abortion go on with a few of my friends. The whole cult is a huge money-making scheme, with its members being instructed to buy the new and improved versions of the hundreds of books and lectured from Hubbard every 10 years or so. Not to mention the auditing that members pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for. People who are in the cult but not in the Sea Org never really know the truth of what goes on in the Sea Org. It is kept under wraps. An experience like mine in the cult is vastly different than someone like Remini's. Question. Do they stalk you or harass you in any way? Were you ever threatened to say anything if you quit? I was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement when I was finally getting out. They held me at knife point to make me sign, and they kept me in a basement room with security guards for several hours until I caved and signed it. They promised to ruin my family's lives if I ever said a word about anything to anyone, including my parents. I kept quiet for years, with the exception of telling my childhood best friend bits and pieces. I got old enough and wise enough to how the world works to realize that the NDA did not mean squat, and I finally started to share my experiences with the world. If you're interested in learning more about exactly how horrible Scientology really is, I recommend watching Leah Remini, from King of Queens fame, or on Miscavige, father to the current leader of the church, on Joe Rogan's podcast, and check out the documentary Going Clear. I really recommend watching Going Clear if you don't know very much about the so-called Church of Scientology. I hope you enjoyed this kind of video, because I really do. Do all the YouTube things, take care of each other, and be kind to each other in the comments. See you all tomorrow or somewhere else right now.